This week on the agenda, France in crisis. Will the fifth Prime Minister in just 2 years succeed in shoring up the country's economy where his predecessors failed? It's been a tough week for French President Emmanuel Macron, having to appoint a fifth Prime Minister in less than 2 years. Former Defence Minister Sebastien Lecornu takes over with the French economy in crisis, debt levels spiralling out of control. So is there any chance he can succeed in turning around French finances where so many others have failed? Here with me now are Douglas Yates, Professor of International Relations at the American Graduate School in Paris, Paul Taylor, Senior Visiting Fellow at the European Policy Centre, and Renaud Foucart, Senior Lecturer in Economics at Lancaster University. Great to have all of you gentlemen on the agenda. Douglas, let me start with you, because to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, to lose one Prime Minister may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose two looks like carelessness. What does losing 4 in 2 years look like?
Well, pure negligence. And so I'm of the opinion that the French Fifth Republic is a semi-presidential system. So there's still a lot of stability here. But obviously, he's breaking records with this government instability. In my view, the problem's been he's not chosen the right prime minister. And Sebastien Lecornu is going to go down in flames.
Paul, do you agree with that? Is he going to go down in flames? Or do you think there's some hope that the country's new Prime Minister, Sebastien Lecornu, is going to have a better chance of forcing a realistic economic plan through this Parliament?
I think the best he can hope to do is to force through some sort of holding budget that doesn't make it worse. And I would probably put his chances of achieving that at barely 50%, possibly less. Because you can change Prime Minister, but it doesn't change the arithmetic in Parliament. You've got 3 blocks in Parliament, a far-right bloc, which is not interested in compromising and wants to bring the government down and ultimately bring the president down so that Marine Le Pen or her right-hand man, Mr. Bardella, could become president. You've got the left-wing bloc that is desperate to bring Macron down and thinks that things are ripe for a sort of almost a revolutionary situation, at least in the radical left. And in the middle, you've got a dwindling centrist group from whom he has chosen his new prime minister. Whether he'll be able to find budget concessions that will keep the socialists from censuring him, bringing the government down again, is the real challenge. I'm not sure he'll be able to do that. And if he does, he'll have to burn bits of President Macron's legacy.
By 2030, the IMF thinks that French public debt will be 130% of GDP, double what it was before the financial crisis in 2008. Renaud, this is as much a financial crisis as it is a political one. Why is the French economy in such a state?
Technically, there is a relatively simple explanation, is that everybody has been spending a lot during the COVID years. France didn't decrease the deficit at this time because Macron cut a lot of taxes, and he tried to replace that by something else. He tried to tax carbon, for instance. But you remember the Yellow Jacket revolt, people were absolutely not willing to get those higher taxes. And also at the same time, France has an increasing pension problem. So a quarter of the budget of France is no pension. Michel Barnier, a previous prime minister, tried a tiny move of just freezing the highest pension. So the very high pension in France can be 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 euro a month. No? So even that was censored by the far right and by the left. So this is the starting point of the problem, but also there is never an emergency in France. Because France in itself, the current account of France is zero. So France does not depend on emergency financing from the rest of the world. This is not Greece 2012. This is not even the UK today. So they can go like very, very slowly into the abyss. At the moment, debt is not that expensive because it was taken at the previous rate when interest rates were low. It's just that the debt of today is getting more and more expensive. So if France doesn't do anything now, it's in trouble. But when they look at the debt over GDP, it's almost the same today as 2021.
Paul, I wonder what you think needs to be done to address all that. France already has the highest tax burden in the developed world, nearly 44% of GDP in 2023. So does that have to change, and how's that going to change?
Well, I think that there's a sense of tax injustice in France, even if it has the highest tax burden. A lot of French people feel that tax falls unfairly, unevenly on the middle class, and that the biggest fortunes and the biggest corporations actually manage to pay very little tax. France is not the only country where that's the case, of course, but France has this sort of revolutionary tradition of rebelling against unjust taxation. So it is a big issue. And I think that Sebastien Lecornu will need to make some sort of gesture on taxing the wealthy in some way, whether it's a surcharge on higher incomes or whatever, in order to restore that sort of, to some extent, that sense of tax justice, which Macron got rid of when he began his presidency by abolishing a wealth tax, which didn't bring an awful lot of revenue, but was symbolically important. Macron believed that that would bring lots of wealthy people back to France and get them investing and so on. That's been rather disappointing. It's been a bit of a damp squib, really. And so France is in that bind. I think that, as Renaud says, if they can get the economy firing a bit more strongly, if they could get more production and therefore more taxable revenue, their problems are not overwhelming in France. But I think that the state has a good record of being able actually to bring in taxation, which is something that the markets trust. Nevertheless, as the public debt goes up and comes closer to the levels of Italy, if not Greece, and Italy or Greece's public debt is actually coming down, and both of those countries have what's called a primary budget surplus. That's to say, in current expenditure, they actually bring in more than they spend. France has not had a primary surplus for decades. So the other thing is that somebody needs to make a go at cutting back the excess levels of public administration, the excess layers of government, regional, local, metropolitan, all sorts of layers of government which employ too many people, and transferring some of that employment to the productive economy.
It's interesting you're talking about that, because France has often been able to hang its hat on good productivity, but there are many layers of bureaucracy. Douglas, I want to bring you in. Look, Paul alluded there to sort of the exodus of wealthy people when there are tax adjustments coming in. What is all this? What impact is all of this having on French people, rich and poor? I mean, we've seen protests on the streets of Paris, Strasbourg, Montpellier, to name just a few. Do you think voters realise something has to be done, or are they going to be very French and dissatisfied about it all?
Well, so the latter, and that's unfortunate. But we have a deeply divided society. And I like to throw in something that Thomas Piketty, a very famous economist here in France, talks about, which is that we're speaking of a debt crisis, but it's a public debt crisis. Never before has France been richer. It's only the public sector that's deeply in debt. But the private wealth in France has reached pharaonic proportions. We've returned to something like the Ancien regime. And as a result of the presence of all that wealth, things are okay. Now, the public sector is suffering, and the people who work in the public sector don't get raises, haven't kept up with the cost of living. People who receive public services, who rely on public transportation, public health, who get their retirement out of the public sector, all of those people are suffering. But then there's the very happy France, and they're the ones that buy and pay for the electoral system. And they've worked with the center, with the right, and they're in bed with the extreme right, who is also now a pro-business party. And so the conflict over taxes and over debt is real. And there's going to be no fundamental agreement because their interests are fundamentally different. What we have is a conflict between private wealth and public wealth.
In which case, Renaud, is there or isn't there a case for the IMF to step in? I mean, do you think that that's what France will need to do, or will this be counterbalanced by the savings and the private wealth in the nation?
There is absolutely no reason to believe that the IMF will intervene anytime soon or even in the future. Like, France is a European country. It is protected also by its belonging to the Eurozone, but also, as I told you before, because simply in itself, and I think this is what Douglas alluded to also, the money is there. It's just simply the public sector which is in deficit. But no, Douglas has been talking about something that I think is very important, is that savings are very high in France and are increasing. But you cannot talk about savings without talking about the story of generational fairness, which is that this France that votes for the center and the right, the France that has the saving, is the France that has been working at a time when there were very few elderly people and a lot of young people. So they could accumulate this wealth simply because they had to give little of their income for pensions. They retired early, and now they have the capital. They receive high pension from the worker, and the reason why, and I think this is something very important that indeed Piketty has pushed a lot on the debate in France, the reason why so much of the money in France comes from inheritance is that it's not possible to earn a lot of money by working. And it's not possible to earn a lot of money by working because you need to pay all the money for the boomers who retired and have these pensions. So I think it's very easy in terms of politics to frame it as the rich versus the poor. You need to tax the rich. And I think I agree that Macron has been terrible at that. Terrible because he's always said, he always ignored the fact that the France public opinion want to tax the rich. But talking about the rich in the abstract, I think it's really, really hiding the fact that there is very real consequence. I give you just one last example. The budget of education in France, the budget of school, 10% of that is diverted just to pay for the balance of the public pension. So when you look at the budget of education in France, it's a fake budget. It's said to be 5% of GDP, but actually a lot of that is diverted just to fill the gap in the pension system.
Paul, I can see you're itching to get in there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've heard two framings of France's problems. One as being the wealthy versus the public sector, the poor public sector, and the other as being generational, the old versus the young, if you like. And you know, each of those I think has some truth in it. But fundamentally, France has a bigger public sector than most other countries in Europe and around the world. It's spending 57% of its national income, of its gross net domestic product, on public spending. Some of that, of course, is on pensions. And indeed, it's hard to hit pensioners because, as we know in the UK, as we know in other countries, pensioners vote, and they vote more than young people do. But I think that to frame it in the way I've heard doesn't entirely take account of the specificities of France, which make it difficult to reform here, and the things that need to be done. I don't believe any of that will happen before the next presidential election, which is due in 2027. Because of this paralyzed parliament, you'll just be able to get minimal budgets over the line, if you can get any budget over the line. There may have to be an earlier dissolution of parliament and fresh snap elections. But if that happens, I think it's most likely to benefit the radical right of the National Rally Party of Marine Le Pen. And I think that everything that's happening at the moment, unfortunately, makes the victory a victory for the far right more likely in the next couple of years, whether it's in parliamentary or in presidential elections. And I would say more likely, but not inevitable. I still think that can be prevented, but I think that things are going in Le Pen's direction at the moment.
But in terms of the economy, in terms of the budget deficit, it seems subsequent governments and the cabinets are just pushing the can down the road. You've ruled out the IMF, Renaud, but what about the European Stability Mechanism? Is there a role for them here to help with that part of the crisis, so that then France might have the breathing space to sort out institutional issues and political issues?
It's actually already playing a major role, because if you look at how expensive it is for France to borrow money right now, it remains much cheaper than what happened during the actual euro crisis in 2012. And the reason why it remains cheaper is precisely the European stability mechanism. So you remember Mario Draghi saying, we will do, the European Central Bank will do whatever it takes within its mandate to save the euro. That's the reason why investors don't bet massively against France. So you can say France borrow at a price that is more expensive than Greece. It's true some days. Maybe today not, but last week, yes. But those amounts are 3.5% versus 12% at the time. So the European stability mechanism is not meant to be actually used. It's meant to say we have a cast iron guarantee that those countries will not default unless the entire of the Eurozone default. This is working right now. This is protecting France, but it's also dangerous because it means that then the moment of making tough decisions can be postponed. So they can kick the can down the road precisely because the interest rate don't get to 12% right now.
Douglas, I want to talk about the state of relations within the European Union, because we think of Germany and France as being those two key leaders of the bloc, the two biggest economies. Is France losing its clout, its premier position in the midst of all of this political and financial turmoil?
Yeah, domestic crisis weakens Macron's position, the optics overseas. Although constitutionally, he has a reserved domain that really makes him much freer than a lot of other European leaders to make decisions, make commitments, negotiate. But when the appearance is that he no longer is in control, it becomes like a lame duck presidency in the United States, like Jacques Chirac at the end, where his domain reservé is sort of cut off from the mainstream. And most European countries are parliamentary systems. So when there's a fall of government or a change of prime minister, the optics are bad. As I said in the beginning, though, in fact, the institutions here give great stability. The presidency actually can weather out 5 years with endless changes in prime ministers, if he chooses to, and continue to execute his functions because of a dual executive. But yes, for European politics, he's not as credible as he would have been if he had been able to solve his domestic crisis. And he was seen as shooting himself in the foot by calling the last legislative elections.
Just to add to what Douglas said, I think there are specific areas where not having a government or a parliamentary majority does weaken even the French president's special domain, reserve domain. And that's, for example, if you look at the defense budget, he has called for massive increases in the defense budget in line with what other NATO countries are doing, but he's got to get a parliament to pass those increases. One of the reasons why France, while it's got a big mouth about supporting Ukraine, has not actually spent that much money on supporting Ukraine, and very little compared to, say, Germany or to Nordic countries, is that it simply doesn't have the budget resources to do that. And he can't, at the moment, put that through Parliament. So that does weaken him. And I think more generally, there's a sense around Europe that, while Macron talks European leadership, people realize that, he's sort of all hat and no cattle at this point. And therefore, I think France may be overruled, for example, outvoted when it comes to ratifying the trade treaty with South American countries, Mercosur, because France doesn't wield the clout in Europe that it once did. And the same may also come when the next European budget is fought over, which will be in the next couple of years, where I think French priorities, which would naturally be a lot of spending on agriculture and on defense and collective borrowing, it's very hard to persuade fellow Europeans that you need to borrow money in common if they feel, or some of them, the richer ones among them, feel that they're simply bailing out France. So I think that France's domestic problems and its inability to get its budget deficits down seriously weakens its voice in those ways in Europe.
Renaud, picking up on something that Paul was just saying there, do you think that France can maybe trade its way out of trouble with partners like China, for example? I mean, we've reported quite a lot this week on the latest Sino-French forum on trade, investment and innovation that was taking place in Paris?
Well, France is, again, not doing extremely bad in terms of its trade situation. So the trade situation of France is actually currently at zero. They sell as much as they buy to the rest of the world. So it's sure that in general, Europe is facing this complicated multipolar world. We are all aware that with the United States, it's not the way it used to be. We are all aware that at the moment, Europe has an energy crisis problem, and that at the same time, there is very cheap solar electric vehicles in China and overcapacity at the moment. So we know that there are geopolitical complexities in there, but maybe as both my co-debaters have underlined, this reserved demand of the president of going in international diplomacy and maybe taking this traditional role of France as being perhaps less aligned with the United States than the rest of Europe is not exactly strengthened by the fact that they have no government. So for that, Macron needs to be seen as strong on the European stage and as being able to put money where his mouth is, which is, again, very complicated when you cannot vote your own budget.
Putting money where your mouth is. Douglas, what do you think in terms of France's prospects for trade?
Well, it's interesting. Because of Donald Trump's tariffs, there's probably going to be a lot of surplus production that's not going to go to the United States because it's, in a gross sense, going to be more expensive for Americans to buy the same amount of goods, and their wages haven't been going up, so they can't afford to buy more. And as a result, the Chinese are probably interested in trying to divert some of that trade to Europe, which does have big pocketbooks. I could imagine a situation where France, which is net zero, a fact I didn't know. That's a very interesting fact, because I'm not used to thinking of living in a country that has a good trade balance. France might be able to benefit from lower cost Chinese goods when you reduce the political cost of tariffs. Can France trade out of its debt? No, because the problem isn't trade, the problem is public spending. And so I think the description that I heard recently was France is like a frog in a casserole, and the water is slowly being increased in temperature, and now they're at 130% debt. Then it will be 131%, and then 132%. And by the time they're aware of what's going on, they'll be boiling.
Renaud, what do you think? Is that frog in the boiling water going to be able to jump out of the casserole, or is living off debt here to stay in the short and the longer term?
Well, at some point, France will have to pass a budget. There will be some return to normalization of budget rules in Europe. We'll not go back to the strict Maastricht criteria, but at some point, European partners will not accept a 6% debt. No, France needs to simply learn to live with its political reality. So if you look at the Parliament of France, it's absolutely not impossible. Like, this is basically the European Parliament majority. You have Social Democrats, a traditional right wing, and a center. Together, they could form a majority. The problem is that the French have been trained to dream of politics as Napoleon Bonaparte. You have a president, you have a majority, you do whatever you want. So they throw a red line on the sand every single time. Like, the left will say, we need capital taxation. The right will say, we will not join if there is capital taxation. In the middle, the center is trying to give a little bit to both. And Lecornu will face exactly the same problem. I think he will try tomorrow to offer something to the Social Democrats, and then the Republicans, the right, will say, we're leaving. Okay, fair enough. But when there is the next parliamentary election, either there will be a new majority, and so this will be an interlude over, or parliamentary democracy is there to stay, and then they will just need to start having adults in the room who can find deals. This is definitely not happening today and not before the next presidential election.
Paul, I can see you nodding along there, and I'm wondering, look, we've had bloc en tout, bloc everything, that movement gaining traction. Do you think that the people of France have had enough? Are we set for a winter of discontent?
I think people are very disenchanted, and I think that there's a great, the public mood is one of a massive distrust of the whole political class, and they don't believe anything they're told, and so on. I think that some people will resort to the radical right as soon as they get a chance at the ballot box because of the sense that they've tried everything else. And this is the one a party that hasn't yet had a foot in power. Not that I think that they have a credible program to put into action if they do get into power, but I think that they may get into power because of that grumpy public mood. I don't feel that the public mood is pre-revolutionary, however. I think there's less mobilization now than there was, for example, during the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests protests 7 years ago, or during the protests that were ultimately unsuccessful against pension reform, against pushing back the retirement age. Again, there's a France. The protests are very much driven by the public sector workers who are more organized, and they can strike more easily. Sometimes they even get paid afterwards for their strike days. Whereas in the private sector, there's very little unionization, and it's much harder to strike. So it depends partly on the will of the public sector workers to strike, to make any movement really take off. We had lots of transport strikes where, they called a transport strike and trains ran almost as normal. So I think it's a mistake to confuse those pictures of, a burning bus somewhere in Bordeaux or Rennes with France being in flames. And you often get that because the way real-time television works. In fact, let me assure you that France is not in flames, and my forecast would be that it also won't be in flames over the autumn and winter. There will be occasional strikes and protests, but the dogs will bark and the caravan will limp on its way.
Douglas, what do you think? What's next for France, politically, economically, socially?
So there has been a very long and very stable increase in voting, in public opinion, and as well in media towards the right. France is a country that is moving towards the right, although there are very strong hard left politicians and parties and discourses. The general public is going to probably vote for Rassemblement National if Marine Le Pen is able to get requalified for Marine Le Pen, and if not, for Jordan Bardella or for another Rassemblement National politician. So within a few years' time, we're going to have France looking like Italy.
Douglas Yates, Paul Taylor, Renaud Foucart, thank you all very much. You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming up on a future agenda, where next for China-UK trade, as the two sides hold their first official talks for 7 years. But for now, from me, Juliet, Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.